Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today we're talking about
doing well in a polarized society. And this is stuff that we probably should have top of mind anyway, but we just went through a very acrimonious election season and a real nail-biter of an election. So I think it's particularly helpful for us now to think about what resources philosophy could contribute to understanding our situation or to helping us cope with it. What did you have in mind, Dan?
Considering that it seems like no one really got everything they wanted, or as the great philosopher Jagger once said, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you just might find you get what you need. Outside of the good Mick Jagger, we have this feeling of divisiveness and polarization, and it is not really good for I'd say our mental health to be constantly living in this. That being the major overtone of the entire way that we look at the world, it becomes this incredibly constant grading fight and constant stress upon you, and it's not going to lead you to your best life, and it's probably not going to lead you to treating others around you in the best way possible.
Yeah, things are so polarized right now. And this has been going on for over a decade that, on dating apps, for example, people won't consider dating somebody who's from the opposite political party. And many people are in effectively in bubbles in their social media where they have very few connections or friends from the opposite side. For myself as like a registered independent who doesn't belong to either party, but, who strategically pivots against the one that I think is the biggest trouble at the time, it's been, something to see. I remember 10 years ago, I would try to get into discussions on Facebook with people who I knew, from childhood. And it always went badly when you'd point out, well, I wasn't doing both sidesism, right? I was saying, well, like this point is actually quite correct, but you're going too far with it. And man, they so quickly they would say, oh, you're one of them, you're on the other side. And you'd be like, no, I'm actually, I'm trying to see things from different points of view. And that is something that is becoming more and more difficult to do, I would say, in the situation that we're in. So and it's way worse today than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago.
And not only are we being sorted into silos from our the media and the social media that we tend to consume, but we're also self-sorting ourselves. And there's been a large movement of people physically moving to places where you are living with only people that have a similar outlook to you. And so no longer is just being neighbors and having to deal with a community in which that is a thing that brings you into good relationships with people that you happen to have different political views, where now it's everyone that also has a very similar political view. And I guess you've also seen this with a lot of Christianity within the United States, where the churches themselves are becoming incredibly polarized as well, kind of to the detriment of the church-going populace, if you think that is something to be beneficial.
Yeah, and it's not just religious groups, it's fandoms, it's all sorts of things, where matters are being split down the middle. or not necessarily down the middle. It could be like, 1/3 goes over this way and the other 2/3 goes over this way. But there's definitely a chasm or a divide that has emerged. I wouldn't even say is emerging, right? It's there, and we're living in it. And it's one of mutual distrust and misunderstanding and a willingness on the part of some people to go pretty far in not just using rhetorical techniques and what one could call verbal violence in some cases, using a lot of the words that we're not going to use in a radio program pretty routinely, but to the extent of physical violence and intimidation. If we don't get some sort of handle on this, we're in real trouble as a society. And there's nothing that, I know a lot of people like to think of America as being exceptional. And there is this thing called American exceptionalism, but it's not a true thing. There's nothing to say that this experiment that we have is going to last another 100 years. And a lot of it will depend on whether we can be members of one society. And I don't want to say everybody gets along as one big happy family or anything like that. That's never been the case, right? And we have some serious issues to grapple with and to start addressing. But if we can't form any sort of consensus that isn't based just on wheeling and dealing and who has power at the time, if we can't make any appeals to something that goes beyond that transactional way of looking at things, or that us versus them way of looking at things, I think we're in real trouble. And some people are worried about that. I think a lot more people are worried about what they perceive the other side to be doing, or their own side not doing enough. I think more people are worried about that.
I think it's a really good way to kind of bring us to one of the central thoughts here in that feeling of alienation, or the state of experiencing of being isolated from a group in which you should belong or which you should be involved. And it feels like we are not only being alienated from our other countrymen, but we're also being alienated from our government. And I guess one of the big ways I see this is that as a representative democracy, like early on, the House was the chamber of the legislature, which was supposed to, at least at a federal level, represent the population. And at the very beginning, we had 30,000 people per representative, and now it's at 700,000 people per representative. And we haven't increased the size of the House since 1912. It used to be a rather regular thing to do congressional apportionment, and it's one of the things that's enacted in the Constitution that allows the Congress to increase its size, and we just have failed to have the political will to actually do that. And once we don't feel that we have a really good say in our representatives, and then you feel that the government doesn't actually represent you or the things that you care about. And especially when you get to like the big office, with the presidency, it can really turn into just us versus every bad person that you can possibly conceive of as your boogeyman that you're going against if they're not the person for you. And this tribalism that has brought us away from that cohesive union that I guess they asked for, the more perfect union.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we ever historically had a great consensus going on, right? I think that sometimes we've certainly had more, but there's certainly been more civility and more willingness to work with other people, which I think some people kind of found boring. It's an interesting thing that this election, so many people did come out to vote on both sides. Well, and even for like the Libertarians or for some other parties as well. It seems like only the Libertarians managed to get a significant portion of the vote this time around as a third party. But a lot of people came out, but they came out, I would say, mainly to say we can't let those other people win. In the past, when we had a lot more a lot more consensus and compromise. I think a lot of people found elections a bit more boring and didn't participate as much. So it's sort of, it's a two-edged sword. Ideally we'd have everybody participating, because it is important to have people's voices heard. In other countries, like for example Australia, if you don't vote, you actually get a fine for not voting. Here in America, there's all these hoops to jump through. Many people make it difficult for other people to vote, and we're kind of an unusual country in that way. On Twitter, my friends from all over the place remark about how it just seems so weirdly difficult to vote in America, and so people are definitely engaged. But they're engaged, you could say, to be enraged, rather than really looking for a lot of solutions. And I'm painting with a broad brush here, right? There are many people out there who are solution-oriented, who are looking to work with other reasonable people. But it feels like those people, and I count myself as one of them, are in the minority, at this point in time. Maybe that's
count me up as.
Oh, go ahead.
Count me down as one of those people that are very much for. I would prefer to have boring politics, politics that are not constantly in my face and trying to induce rage in me. I feel like this constant drumbeat of like almost political warfare is not good for the well-being of basically anyone in this country, except for those that are directly profiting off of it.
Yeah, politics in part is about deliberation, and deliberation is a rational function. We're supposed to, the way that the political system has worked, even taking America out of the picture, but just thinking about classical political theory, you've got competing interests, you've got people who have different perspectives, and they still have to live in one society, whether it's a Greek city-state or an empire or pick whatever else you want. They have to find some way to live together and to not, be at each other's throats and to get some basic things done. The aqueducts need to run somewhere, right? Somebody has to pay for that sort of stuff. And so there's a lot of decisions that do need to be made. And deliberation is one of the things that we can do as human beings that raises us from the level of the mere animals. And I think you're right. That's been short-circuited in a lot of cases. It's almost as if instead of having rational, persuasive appeals, the emphasis is on just let's push everybody's buttons as much as we can.
It's almost as if it's the extension of the election to constant election.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That instead of, okay, we have a point where we're going to choose leaders and they are going to rationally deliberate for the good of all the people in the country and try to mix these competing interests of these disparate groups, but we still are all under one umbrella, is turned into a constant catfight for either 2, 4, or 6 year intervals depending on the election.
Yeah. Again, to compare America to other countries, quite a few other places specify when you can actually run. So like in British politics, you can't run for 2 years before you're actually being elected. I forget exactly what it is, but it's not a long time, and it would be awesome if we actually had stuff like that. There's so many ways. I mean, we could do an entire sequence on the so many different ways in which our democratic processes have been subverted. But going back to that issue of alienation that you were talking about, I think that's part of what makes a lot of people feel despondent. And in some ways that raises the stake of, well, this is the one time you get to vote, so you better get your vote in and make sure that it happens. But, the rest of the time we're not voting. And we might be registering our views by actually like calling or emailing or tweeting out to a representative. It's debatable how much they actually pay attention or care. We'll talk about gerrymandering in a minute and why that's alienating. But I think a lot of people feel kind of shut out of the political process. And what you were saying with having so many people for each representative. You're probably not going to get to talk to your representative. You're going to get to talk to somebody who's on their staff. And then maybe if what you have to say is important enough, they'll kick it upstairs, unless you've got some juice. And I think this is one of the big issues as well. It's not just that people who are wealthy and can make campaign contributions get the ears more often, not just of, Republicans, but also Democrats. This is clearly an equal opportunity thing. But, corporations do it as well. And, since Citizens United, corporations can spend whatever they like, and it's considered to be free speech on their part. I think because of these sorts of things, the ordinary person comes to feel like, well, their voice doesn't matter very much. And that is alienating. So, either it's like the stakes are super high and you better vote. If you don't vote, you're letting everybody down. But your vote doesn't really count for all that much. I mean, in this election, in some places it could, like if you're in Wisconsin or Michigan. But if you're living in...
But if you were in...
Yeah, California.
Kentucky or California, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So... and also, when we look at, well, let's talk about gerrymandering. I think that's something quite important. And we probably have to define that because some people don't know what it is. And we didn't say it.
Isn't that a type of salamander?
Yeah, it's the movement it makes as it wobbles around. I was going to say we didn't say it in a sufficiently disapproving tone of voice for everyone to know that it's a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
But gerrymandering really is. Yeah, it's terrible. And Wisconsin is one of the worst states for it. We actually had a case, unfortunately, turned down by the Supreme Court, where they could have done something about it, and it produces these results. I mean, we were joking around before the show about one of the legislative districts that spans a couple different cities, and saying, "Wow, this doesn't make any sense. It's nice that the candidate won, but." What are they actually reigning over, And so it's not just a problem for Wisconsin. North Carolina is also egregiously gerrymandered, and there's all sorts of other places in Texas. And what it leads to is really bad political representation because it creates all these safe seats for people who, if you live in that district, the Republicans are going to win or the Democrats are going to win. And that's all there is to it, unless there's somebody really screws up. And, for somebody like myself, an independent, it's even worse because, our votes essentially count for nothing against the mass of whatever, whether it's red or blue has been put in there. For the district. And, I can see how a lot of people would feel like, well, the fix is in, my vote doesn't matter, my voice doesn't matter. I think it's not just their vote. I think it's that they feel that no matter what they do, it's not going to make any real difference. So that's a real alienation, right?
Yeah, it is like quintessential alienation. That this thing that we are, supposedly participating in, our democracy, our political process in which we give the voice to the people to at least elect our representatives. And in some states we have even direct democracy with binding referendum that change the laws directly. That, if you don't feel that because the way the rules were drawn up that you can't ever win, like why would anyone have any incentive to actually go out and play the game?
Yeah, and it's not just that you can't win, which is bad enough by itself. Because you can't win, nobody has to listen to you. Nobody has to pay attention to what you have to say. You call up your representative, is like, well, who are you? Why do I care? And I think this also kind of figures in to, think about the recent presidential elections going back a ways. by the time that it gets around here to Wisconsin, the primaries are, pretty far along. We're not in Super Tuesday. We don't really have much of a choice in deciding like who's going to go on to the big leagues and actually like engage in the primary contest. That is the national election. And so, it's easy to get a little bit disheartened about that and to say, well, we're stuck with what this party puts forward and what this party puts forward. There's all of, that sort of issue. And then there's, the incredible role that donations and money plays in that. So even if you did belong to a political party, other than ultimately being told, well, get behind the candidate, whoever that happens to be that somebody else has selected, you don't really have that much role to play, it feels like, in a lot of cases. And sometimes you get candidates that you can feel strongly about and be like, yeah, I really like this person. That hasn't been the case most of the time in my experience. And I think there's also groups that get, really taken for granted by both parties, and they don't get very well treated by the parties, and that also would be alienating. This expectation that, well, what are you going to do? You're going to vote for the other party and show us, Yeah.
And so a potential solution, not that I say is a panacea for this particular portion of the alienation, would be something along the lines of an instant runoff, where you say like, okay, here are all the candidates, and I can rank them 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Say if there are 10, and this way I can say like, oh, like say I'm very libertarian, like I voted for Joe. And then my next preference might be Trump or something, and on the way down. And so the whole idea is that, whoever has the least amount of votes on the first round, they get dropped off the ballot, and all of their votes are then reapportioned to the next candidate, whatever their number twos were. And so this allows you to say, okay, I'm not throwing my vote away. I'm still putting out, this is the person that I would most prefer. But just because I choose this person as my most preferred, that's the word, that doesn't mean that I can't also say, if that person does not make it, then this would be my next preference. And it also gives you this feeling that the people that actually win it, instead of having a first past the post where you can have a person that wins with less than 50% winning the election, that you always have someone that has a majority winning an election.
Yeah, they call that ranked choice voting, right? I think in some other places.
Ranked choice or instant runoff. I think they're interchangeable.
I think there's a state, and I'm blanking on which one it is, that actually has that. Oh, right, yeah, and I mean I would think that would be good. That would produce more participation and maybe better thought out voting on the part of a lot of people, But that I don't see that as likely to get passed in too many places. Do you?
No, because the incumbent parties, it makes sense for them to be against that.
Yeah, So this is not something that we were actually going to talk about, but I think this also fits in with the alienation thing as well. So we're kind of caught in a bind, because putting aside the massive partisanship and divides between, liberals and conservatives and, Republicans and Democrats on so many things, you're right. They do kind of all come together in making sure that nothing is really going to be different going forward as far as how things are done. We were talking before this about how some of my colleagues outside of the United States, they look at what we go through with the Electoral College and they're like, why don't you move away from that? Why don't you get rid of that? And then we say, if we could, we would. But do you understand how difficult it would be to change it? You would have to have a constitutional amendment. And then they say, well, that doesn't sound so hard. Why don't you do that? And then you say, Well, take a look at what it requires, what sort of consensus you have to build in order to get that. And so on the one hand, there's no way that you're going to bring everybody together and get them to agree to that, just because of the factionalization that we have and how divided people are and how distrustful they are of the other side. Even if you could, though, they'd be like, well, this goes directly against our interests. Why the hell would we do that? Why would we open the door to having things, more, participational? This is a terrible idea. And unfortunately, we're stuck with all of these people as our rulers and our representatives. And to get rid of all of them at one fell swoop would be very difficult to even imagine, let alone pull off. So we're kind of stuck with it. And that I think the cumulative effect of this is that people feel despondent. They feel disengaged. They feel like, oh, I am going to go and vote because I want to make a statement. But then what happens? What happens after that? What did your political will actually accomplish? It's almost like a Sisyphean task, right, of pushing the boulder up the hill, and then it just falls down on the other side, and you push it up again, and you at a certain point Sisyphus has to say, man, this is BS. Why am I doing this? But if we do that, then that doesn't work either, right? It's almost this is a real conundrum, because if we disengage totally from voting, then other people's votes count and ours don't at all, and then we get perhaps even worse outcomes.
Yeah, that little monochrome of not power but like agency.
Yeah, the capacity to determine things. Yeah.
Yeah. So why shouldn't we just force a perfect monoculture and make sure that everyone just thinks the same way here? Wouldn't that make everything just better?
Well, I mean, trying to do that in a multicultural society is very difficult anyway. But I think that would be a bad approach. I mean, there are a lot of people who are like, I just want everyone to shut up. I don't want any more of this argument, right? Just pick something and stick to it. That's not a very rational way to get good outcomes, right? I mean, part of why we want democratic processes is so we can take different perspectives into view and hear from other people and have them represented. And, I think once you start talking about like having unity imposed on people, it sounds like some sort of totalitarianism or fascist approach to things, and those have been tried. They almost never work the way that they're well, yeah, even in the short term. They impose a lot of cruelty and brutality upon people, but they're pragmatically, they don't work. They wind up ruining their economies and getting themselves into stupid military adventures and getting people killed off. And I think we can say that there's been sort of a historical verdict on those. I mean, we do have arguably fascist or totalitarian light, we'll call them at this point, governments that have arisen within recent years that we can point to, but I don't think their long-term prospects are particularly good.
It reminds me of Star Wars and Princess Leia talking to Darth Vader saying, the more you tighten your grip, Lord Vader, the more star systems slip through your grasp.
Yeah, I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, do you think that really works that way, or?
Well, it's either they slip or they you crush them out.
Yeah,
and you
get conformity.
You get a conformity, but you also destroy the spark that moves a lot of modern economies, as well as who wants to live in that drudgery?
Yeah,
and constant fear of potential death.
Yeah, that's a good point. Imposing some sort of absolute across the board orthodoxy, usually it doesn't just stop innovation in the sense of things in the tech sector. I mean, it does it across the board. It destroys the spirit of people. So yeah,
politics, business, philosophy, the university's science.
Yeah.
Like if it doesn't fit within the perfect confines that have been defined by the ruling class, then it becomes, outside of the bounds, and anyone who's doing that becomes persona non grata.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta push pretty hard sometimes to actually get yourself in trouble in some of those institutions, but some people manage to do it anyway, And then there's all sorts of irrational inequities as well. I was just reading something, so this is a little bit off topic, but it's something I'm thinking about posting, and it had to do with student evaluations. So this person did an experiment, and you could do it because it was an online class, and they created an avatar and persona for themselves. One being female, one being male, different names, different pictures that were being used, and then they interacted as the same TA with all of these students. And it was a big class too. It was like, 200 students or so. And then at the end of the semester, they had evaluations. And the evaluations for the female presenting person, the TA, were significantly worse than they were for the male. And we know that this is the case in student evaluations. And it's an irrational thing. It's not, I mean, I could tell you that just looking at evaluations of some of my female peers, they're not teaching worse than male teachers are. The bar is pretty low for most of the male teachers already. And we can do a whole show on that, right?
I will concur on that.
Yeah. And so it's clearly because of some sort of bias or, and so there's inequities like that. And those don't get addressed very often, There's inequities like that based on race in our society. Classism plays a huge role, So when we could go back to this, like, let's impose some solution from on high, it almost never fixes those things adequately, What we need is much more lower level, fixing things like on the ground, changing things as individuals and in our relationships, but also in political ways. But maybe we could say in locally political ways. And if there's going to be something coming in from up on high, maybe it's got to interface with those things adequately,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving on from totalitarianism.
Thankfully.
I guess, hopefully, yeah.
Yeah.
So what was your thoughts on, like, the difference from 2016 to now?
2016, if you think about how the candidates were selected, and the primary season, it was really quite different than this one. On the Democrat side, we had, like an heir apparent Hillary Clinton who had, put in her time, sort of like how John McCain had been in the previous election cycles. McCain got to be the candidate after Bush because he'd been in there and he'd done all these sort of things. And I think Clinton kind of thought that, and a lot of her backers thought that it was kind of owed to her. And there was really only one other candidate that was worth noticing, and that was Bernie Sanders. And he's a very interesting person, but kind of an outlier. He was able to get a movement going that could last into this election cycle as well. But he is an independent who caucuses with Democrats, and so on that side it was like, well, there'll be an election, there'll be a primary season, but a lot of people kind of felt like the fix was in. And there wasn't an awful lot of enthusiasm, I think, for Clinton as a candidate. And then we had the weirdness of the Republican thing with all these different candidates. For the first time, we had to have separate debates because they couldn't all be on the stage at the same time. And we get this at that time, crazy nutty uncle Trump somehow making it through all of these things. I mean, what we know now, what he did was he mobilized a lot of aspects of American life that had been there in the Tea Party and that he could appeal to, like racism. And it turned out that was quite a potent message. And then he could also like just say things that were insulting to other candidates, like, making fun of Ted Cruz's wife, for example, making fun of his father, calling Marco Little Marco, Marco Rubio, and just all sorts of crazy stuff that the people were like, can you believe this guy? How is he going to survive the next like challenge to him? And he kept on like blowing through it, sort of like a Mr. Magoo, of politics. And all these other like traditional candidates. I mean, think about Jeb Bush, he was the front runner and he just disappeared.
Yeah.
That was the end of his political career, right? So you've got these two candidates, the guy who's, claiming that he's this successful businessman, doesn't appear to like be able to hold a thought very long. People are kind of wondering about him. And then you've got Hillary Clinton running as well, not running here in Wisconsin, as we know, right?
And there's the alienation once again.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, people did also vote for libertarians or for Greens. And there was also the Constitution Party at the time. And interestingly, I mean, turnout was up, we can say. So that's kind of a good thing. And then we had, the midterms, and turnout was pretty good for these midterms as well. People are getting more interested in politics, but they seem to be getting, like we said before, they're interested in politics in part because they're like, we can't let those SOBs win,
Right.
And I don't know go ahead.
Oh yeah, just the idea of like, if your politics are screw the other guy, then like,
yeah,
why are you in this place where like politics and consensus and rational debate are something that we ostensibly actually care about, or just do we not anymore?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is if enough people don't care about it and are more into it to what's the meme version of it, to not to own the other people, but not to enrage them. I'm blanking on it right now. To provoke the other side.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not a viable political platform. That's not going to get anything done. And I think if there's too much of a critical mass of that, then we're in deep trouble. And then if you're one of the people who wants to see some sort of rational politics and consensus, that would be quite dismaying.
Yeah, very disheartening.
Yeah.
But I think we do have a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, because we're going to actually use a little bit of our philosophy to deal with how to deal with these things.
Before we get to that, though, let me. I just thought of this. Let me bounce a question off of you. Okay. So this was an election where nobody really got what they wanted. I mean, nobody really got what they wanted from the primary season. Mm-hmm. And I think there's even plenty of people in the conservative and Republican camp who are like, yeah, I mean, this guy, I don't know that we really, we voted for him back in 2016, but he's a hot mess, and I don't know that he's exactly what we want for the party, right? I mean, they're happy that he got them the judges that they wanted, but that was basically it. Judges and tax cuts, before he pushed Ryan out of the whole leadership. Basically the whole party, right? Wisconsin has done terribly, by the way, in terms of its Republican political leadership. We lost Ryan, we lost Priebus. They just got swallowed up by this administration. But going back to this, right? So this is an election where nobody really got what they wanted, unless what you were is a centrist who loves gridlock and loves people fighting with each other. Would it be better if we'd had like a dramatic Republican victory or a dramatic Democratic victory? Like, let's make it something like this. And this is kind of a comic book sci-fi kind of situation. They win the presidency. They win a majority of the Senate, and they win it in such a way that they've got 60 seats. And they win, a vast majority of the House of Representatives. Let's say they got like 300 representatives, right? So you've got like a clear domination of not just the presidency, but the whole legislative branch, whether it's Republican or Democrat, would that have been a better outcome than this messy, now we have to figure out what our way forward is going to be, even though we all hate each other at this point in time? Is it better to have like an absolute, like, here's the people who won, now everybody else shut up and get with the program? What do you think?
I guess it depends on who you are. And so I think, like, right now, I think the large corporations love this outcome because there's going to be gridlock, and there's very little chance that big change will happen, which would usually costs them money, or they have to innovate out of it to deal with the new political realities.
That's actually that's a great point, though. And not only do they like it because of that, they like it because then they can keep still funneling money to both parties and getting the results that they want, right?
Right, absolutely. But I guess my personal, like, political proclivities seem to be that some of the policy positions I think are really necessary for a more perfect union, a world that has more flourishing in it, are only being represented by one party. And I guess from a personal position, I think, like, it requires that, at least in the political landscape that we're currently in. But do I think that's good? I don't know. Like, I guess if it was actually the will of the people, that everyone was actually like, hey, look, like, for the most part, we're all going in this direction.
Yeah.
I would say I'd be, like, rather happy with that, because not only is it what I think it would be better, result in better policy, but it's not like me or the people that I'm with forcing the issue onto someone and causing extra alienation that way, but that it's politically popular and people want to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting that there are some things that I think you and I could probably find some common ground on and say, this policy represents a certain ethical stance, a right way of approaching things, like not letting people think about healthcare, right? Our healthcare system is a total mess. So many people fall through the cracks. Even if you're like totally, it should all be free market. It's not a free market. It's just a mess. And you compare us to other countries, and you see that they do have universal health care. It's not perfect, but it sure is way better than what we've got right now. And it's a nice thing to have during a pandemic too. So
don't get me onto asymmetric knowledge problems.
Yeah, well, yeah. That could be another show too, right?
It could be, yeah.
All different variants of that. That would actually be a good topic. But so we could say that this would be a good policy to get through, and it's probably not going to get through due to gridlock. And even if it's like a pared down version and it gets pushed through, if it's very unpopular, then it can become this, like this canker, essentially, like the Affordable Care Act, that I'll tell you, we use it because we're small business people, and thank God for it, because otherwise we wouldn't have medical treatment for all the things that we need to do, and we pay still a good bit of money in the marketplaces, and it's not perfectly efficient or anything like that, but that has become a bone of contention for so many people on the conservative side. They want to kill it no matter what, right? And then other people are like, oh, we've got to stop them from killing it. And my question to them is always, how are you going to make it better so it actually does what it's supposed to do? And then they just look at me like I'm stupid.
Right.
But if we did have a clear majority on the blue side, maybe we would be able to push through things like that. Which we're definitely going to have to do sooner or later. I mean, things can't go on this way permanently. There are some things that we probably could just keep kicking down the road, but I don't know that this is one of those. Figuring out what to do about student loan debt, that's probably another one we can't keep kicking down the road forever, right?
Right.
So, Yeah.
We really need to move
Talk
to
about
like
philosophy.
philosophy, yeah, and
Yeah.
specifically like some of the strategies that we can employ in order to have a little bit more equanimity in our lives, tranquility in our thoughts, and so one
So,
of them is to yeah.
well, before we do that, what if somebody was to object? Wait a second, in this terrible, screwed up political situation, who are you to have equanimity? Aren't you like carving out your own little private space for yourself? You privileged person. How can you not care about how bad things are? I mean, I think there's a good response to that, and I think you have a good response to that as well, right?
Yeah, if just because there are trials and tribulations and bad things happening within the world, doesn't mean that you can't find your own equanimity, as well as it is really important for you to have at least a modicum of equanimity in order to actually uh, go out and produce actions that result in better outcomes in the world. And you say like, oh, there's all these things going and everything is on fire. And it's like, well, if I'm here and I'm going, and running around in circles, it helps nothing. It doesn't help me and it doesn't help them. I need to have some center in order to actually go out and help them.
Yeah, I think that's a great response, and it also, kind of models what we want to be moving towards. We can't all be like engaging in crisis actions all the time. That's not a life. That's something that sometimes we have to do to preserve a life, but I don't think that that's something that we want. So I think that's a great response. That makes perfect sense. Hopefully, listeners who are enraged at us for suggesting that we should carve out a little time and space for ourselves apart from, constantly being engaged in politics, we'll hear it that way too.
So one of the things you can do is you can employ some historical perspective. Avoid making these usually wrong and easy analogies about like the actual enormity of the perceived bad that we're in. Look at like the fall of empires, the sacking of cities, or plagues that are worse than the plague that we're currently in, like the Black Death that killed 36% of the population of Europe. And it's like we're right now, because of our really good health system, COVID is only down to 1 or 2% death rate, at least in the United States. Think of like half of everyone that dying, and like that really puts it in perspective. Like we've made it through that as a species in the past, and we can make it through this.
Yeah, I think that could also lend itself to somebody going too far with that point of view and saying, oh, well, see, if it's not as bad as the Black Death, it's not really bad,
No.
But I think some historical, the answer to like misusing historical perspective is let's get even more historical perspective, I think. And, you might say, well, that's history. That's not philosophy. Well, since the 19th century, philosophy has, at least certain kinds of philosophy, been very much about cultivating historical perspective, And we could even say that this is something that was around before, Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations suggests we should do exactly what you were saying. Think about the fall. I don't know if you mentioned the falls of empires, but he certainly talked about the sacking of cities, right? How all these things happen over and over again, and the human race still continues on. It's not the absolute end of the world, although it may be the end of a political regime.
Yeah, and then the next thing, as we were talking about earlier, gaining a little equanimity in order to actually focus on what really is in your control, that what you can actually do to materially or mentally affect the well-being of those people around you that you like want to do good for.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be realistic in the amount of good that we can do. For one thing, anything political, if it involves other people, they might say no to us. They might use our efforts and then not return anything on the investment of time and energy and even emotion that we've made. But that's not our problem. That's in a certain respect, that's them just being not so great people. It didn't mean that everything that we did was totally in vain. Um,
Mhm.
Everybody who went around canvassing, I saw people too, saying, "Oh man, I spent all this money, supporting candidates, sending in these contributions, and these are people who didn't have a lot of money to begin with. It was all wasted." No, it wasn't. It wasn't wasted. It just didn't accomplish what it was that you hoped for it to accomplish. And so having a better perspective on that can make one feel less, I don't know, angry or sad or upset.
I would say it's really, at least within Stoic philosophy, one of the big things is that you don't want to put your desire in the outcomes of things, but in doing the right things well.
Yeah.
And so just because the outcome didn't have the outcome that you wanted, was going out there and trying to advocate for your position not the good thing to do in the time, just because it didn't have the exact outcome that you wanted?
That's actually a great point. You think about like canvassing or being on a phone or text bank and
Mhm.
getting, responses from people like, screw you, your candidate's awful,
Mhm.
Um, Interestingly, Epictetus, when he's talking about the philosopher Socrates, who the Stoics looked at as kind of like they thought if anyone's going to be a sage, probably Socrates was. Epictetus said Socrates had about a 1 in 1,000 success rate. Maybe
Mhm.
one person out of 1,000 that he talked to actually changed their life for the better. It doesn't mean that he was wasting his time all that time. He was actually doing a good thing. You don't control what other people do with the message, and if you can say that, then things become less high stakes, right? So if I want to
Mhm.
convince you that you made a bad voting decision and you should vote differently next time, you and I can have a conversation, and I can pursue it up to a certain point, and you can say, "Hey, listen, you're not going to convince me," and I can say, "Okay, but just put the ideas out there, food for thought
Mhm.
for you." That's probably much more likely to be successful than if I keep on pushing stuff down your throat, and because then you're like, that guy, those people, they're
Yeah.
they're they're awful that way. So sometimes by using these techniques or insights that do help us to have equanimity, we can actually be more effective.
So, like, there are lots of interesting techniques in persuasion. There's a big like topic within psychology and philosophy of like what is actually good persuasive technique,
Yeah.
and almost never will you get someone who's like, oh yes, I've now seen the light. I'm going to change my entire life because I changed this pillar of my entire being. And like
From from
a
a
lot
from
of
from a
times,
single philosophical argument, you mean? Or
yeah.
yeah, that never
So
happens.
there are certain things that people kind of rest their personalities on, and they're like
Yeah.
the worldview that they live in, and they protect these ideas like they protect their body from harm. And
Yeah.
it's actually interesting. There's been studies on what portions of the brain light up when someone has one of their core values be uh,
Criticized or
criticized or poked at with a good argument, and it results in the same area of the brain that results from like, oh, I shouldn't touch the hot stove, because your brain's
interesting.
like, I need to save that portion of my brain that is really important to me. It's going to cause me a lot of pain if I lose that. As well as you get things like the backfire effect, where people are presented with information that directly contradicts an idea, and they actually, if you don't do this well, if you're just like, you should do this, and you just throw a whole bunch of facts at them,
Yeah.
often you'll have a point where they actually believe that position even more, um, which is
Yeah.
kind of crazy. It's very interesting, but there are techniques out there. There's a group on the internet that does what they call street epistemology, where
Yeah,
they
talk
don't
about what that
usually
actually
attack.
is, because I've heard about
Okay,
that, and I don't really understand that well.
okay. So epistemology is the way how you know things. Um, in a really simple way of putting it. And so street epistemology is a way of having conversations, and the point of the conversation is to exit the conversation with both people enjoying that they've had the conversation, And so you're never gonna like be trying to like trigger someone or attack their core values. You're asking, okay, you hold a position that you usually hold very strongly, and usually it's best if you're talking about a position that makes you change your actions in the real world. And then you ask them, why do you believe that is true? How did you come to that conclusion? And a lot of times people have bad reasons, ad populum, just because that's how they grew up, and that's the ideas that their parents told them. There's all these things, and they're not logically sound. And so that's a really good way to get people not to the aha moment, but a moment. And the moments are the really good ones, because it's like, oh, once you're in you're like, I'm in a position where I might be willing to learn.
The flip side of that is, so if you are presenting something that's an alternative to what they think, and not necessarily as like a total package, but just at least some alternative ways of thinking about it, they're more likely to be willing to consider it if you haven't been a jerk to them in the conversation, right? So they can only, and it's not just about, well, I don't like how that person made me feel. It's also about you representing a reasonable person who sees things somehow differently, and then they can think, well, what's going on there? I mean, that person seems to be normal in other respects, and yet they hold this position. I don't know. Maybe I have to look into that position a bit more.
Mm-hmm. So,
well, we should talk about the practice that we wanted to close on, because we're getting close to the end of the show.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
So, in this time where people might be finding like, okay, well, now what? Like, the election's over, and I've been so engrossed in this giant pageantry for the last what feels like 2 years of forever, or 2 years going on forever.
Yeah.
But find some practice that will either mentally or materially make your life better, and then set an implementation intention to set it in motion. And so an implementation intention is basically an if-then statement. So, for example, if I said I wanted to make a change and like improve my health a little bit, and I'm going to take up jogging. And so I say, if I wake up in the morning, then I'm going to put on my shoes and go for a 3-mile run. And it helps even better if you put your shoes right in front of your bedroom door in the morning, so you can't even open your door without having to move those shoes. That's even better. But the idea is to make a plan that's usually an if-then statement, and either say it to yourself out loud or write it down, and that seems to really improve the outcomes of you actually doing it. And hopefully the outcome here is that you're going to have some sort of practice. What is it, meditation or exercise, or I don't know, reading a good book, or
reaching out to a friend who you haven't talked to for a while.
Yeah, or having a better, more substantive conversations in a constructive sense and not a adversarial sense.
Yeah. Now, why is this a good practice to get into? Well, you've already hit on part of it. It's going to improve your life in some manner, but it also helps to distract you from all of the turmoil and partisanship that we've gone through, and put some new ideas into your head. Focus on something else for a change. And you could actually like say, okay, every time that I'm tempted to like look at an opinion poll, I'm going to do this instead. Or at least I'm going to think about the thing that I'm changing instead.
Yeah. And you don't want to get ruminating about all these political things, and like it's just spinning in your mind's eye. But I think we need to leave you today with the words of Mark Twain. Loyalty to country always. Loyalty to government when it deserves it.